Hello, and welcome to another episode of Dimwits, Dipshots, Dufuses, and Dullards. So, as I explain in every episode, I call it dip shots because in the first 2 minutes of a YouTube video, you're not allowed to swear apparently because it messes you up in the algorithm because they're afraid of scary, offensive language. But anyway, in this episode, which is episode 13, I'm going to be looking at Trump's Signalgate, as some are calling it, and also some of the weaknesses of the Biden Harris, um, you know, industrial complex, I guess you could call it. So, U.S. officials have discussed Yemen bombing plans and leaked signal messages, which is a pretty popular story right now. So I'm going to give you some insight on what's going on there. The Atlantic has released new Signal group chat messages involving top U.S. officials, exposing detailed discussions about bombing Yemen. These conversations occurred despite claims from President Trump and his administration that no classified information was shared. And Pete Hegseth, the Pentagon chief, had insisted as recently as Tuesday that nobody was texting war plans. However, the leaked messages suggest otherwise. While it also suggests that Hegseth and these other people are liars. So, details of U.S. operations in Yemen were exposed, and the messages revealed specifics about U.S. military operations in Yemen, including planned bombings, drone launches, and even weather conditions relevant to these strikes. Signal, an encrypted messaging app often used for privacy, was used by senior Trump administration officials to communicate about these sensitive matters. According to The Atlantic, these conversations contained enough operational detail to raise serious concerns about national security and transparency. The U.S. has conducted numerous airstrikes and drone operations in Yemen over the past decade, targeting, well, ostensibly targeting Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Houthi forces. However, it should be noted, and this is something that the U.S. media and even to some degree the international press is overlooking, these operations have resulted in significant civilian casualties, contributing to Yemen's ongoing humanitarian crisis. So that's sort of like the story within a story that's really being overlooked, if not buried. The US backed Saudi led coalition has been criticized for its role in the war, which has left over 150,000 people dead and millions facing famine. So there you go. That's a little bit of the story that people should be talking about considerably more. And the intelligence chiefs are still probably, as I speak, trying to deny the violations, but the concerns grow. During a Congressional Intelligence Committee hearing, U.S. intelligence leaders, so called intelligence leaders, denied that the messages contained classified information or that they broke any laws or anything like that. But despite these details and these denials, Democratic lawmakers accused the Trump administration of being reckless and misleading the public. They questioned how operational details about airstrikes could be considered unclassified, pressing for accountability and transparency. The leaked messages raised concerns about whether sensitive military information was improperly shared, especially since the group chat allegedly included a journalist. Sharing such information on a non secure platform like Signal risks compromising U.S. military operations and diplomacy in the region. So, the The scandal has even led to some Republican senators demanding an investigation. Now, I don't know how serious they are or if they're just sort of showboating, but it's a bit of an unusual move to have prominent Republican senators join Democrats these days in demanding an investigation, in this case into the Signal leak. They expressed concerns that the scandal could become a significant political problem if left unaddressed. The bipartisan pressure suggests that the implications of the leak extend beyond partisan politics and highlight the potential threat to national security. The private data of Trump officials has also been compromised, so they're being sloppy all over the place here. The fallout has intensified with a report from German magazine Der Spiegel revealing that the private data of top Trump administration officials, including Pete Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard, and Michael Waltz, is accessible online. The breach raises further concerns about the security of communications used by senior government officials and the vulnerability of sensitive information. So, from certain perspectives, they would say that public interest and transparency are at stake here. The Atlantic emphasized the public's right to know about the information shared through these channels, especially as Trump's advisors downplay the significance of the leaks. The use of Signal by senior officials to discuss military operations raises questions about the adequacy of safeguards against unauthorized disclosures and the potential for compromising U.S. military strategies. So, from my perspective, the leaks reveal the dangers of centralized power and unchecked military authority. The U.S. government's repeated interventions, or quote unquote interventions in Yemen, justified as part of the war on terror, have actually devastated communities and perpetuated violence. The Signal scandal further exposes how high level officials manipulate public perception while operating in secrecy, highlighting the need for greater accountability and, in my view, dismantling of unaccountable militaristic structures that jeopardize global public safety. So, that's my view more than the mainstream narrative here. And I guess the point is there's a pattern of secrecy and mismanagement that's being exposed. That's my take on it. The Yemen conflict, fueled by U.S. weapons and logistical support to Saudi Arabia, which is, I should remind you, a major human rights abuser. I've talked about them many times on this podcast, but it exemplifies the destructive consequences of imperialistic policies. While officials debate the legality of signal communications, the reality is that U.S. actions in Yemen have exacerbated suffering and instability. Leaks like these offer rare glimpses into the inner workings of power, often revealing how little regard there is for democratic insight or the lives of those impacted by these so-called military interventions. That's what George Carlin called soft language. You call it an intervention, it sounds a little more benign than, blowing people to bits or whatever. So, what comes next? As the investigation unfolds, the Signal scandal is likely to fuel further scrutiny of the Trump administration's handling or mishandling of sensitive information and military operations. Both parties face pressure to address not only the legal implications of the leak, but also the broader consequences of U.S. actions in Yemen. The public, armed with this new information, may, and in my view should, demand deeper reforms to prevent future abuses of power. With mounting evidence and bipartisan concern, this scandal may have lasting repercussions, challenging the narratives of secrecy and control that have long defined U.S. foreign policy. Because, the people who claim to be experts on foreign policy are really the ones to bungle it the most. We live in a global era where people could be connected globally and we could be at peace for the most part with the world at large, but foreign policy is often just another word for fucking shit up. You know, that's the simple truth of it, and we're seeing people bumbling and fumbling all over the place. So that's the end of the first segment of this episode. Now I'm going to get in what could be another controversial era. I'm going to be talking about what this segment calls the peripheral poophead of the week. So I'm going to go with Kamala Harris this week. It's somebody who's on the periphery, but who still has some influence, to some degree. So I I actually I did vote for Kamala. So I know some people are going to be like, how could you trash talk her or whatever? But I did vote for her, and this is not my attempt to, sabotage the Democratic Party in general or anything like that. But I do want to look at some of her career and its flaws, and partly why she might have lost, in addition to the fact that we now know that Republicans most certainly threw out some votes that could have numbered in the millions in the 2024 election. There was some voter disenfranchisement going on. And I'm not meaning to completely overlook that. But she did nevertheless lose. And if she had done better, throughout her career and during the campaign, it could have resulted in her overwinning to the extent that even if there was voter disenfranchisement, she might have still had a more stable victory that could have overpowered, the numbers that Trump had gained. So basically, I'm going to call this Kamala Harris a career of symbolic firsts and controversial policies that were sort of swept under the rug as far as scrutiny goes. So Kamala Devi Harris was born on the 20th of October in 1964 in Oakland, California. She made history as the first female, first African American, and first South Asian American vice president of the United States, serving from 2021 to 2025 under President Joe Biden. While her rise to power broke multiple barriers, her record reflects a commitment to maintaining the status quo of American imperialism and, let's face it, punitive justice, and in some ways, corrupt justice. So her legal career and tough on crime policies are going to be focused on a little bit here. Harris began her career in the Alameda County District Attorney's Office, followed by roles in the San Francisco District Attorney's Office and the City Attorney's Office. Elected San Francisco District Attorney in 2003, she promised progressive reforms but often pursued policies that disproportionately harmed marginalized communities. Her office oversaw high conviction rates and fought to uphold wrongful convictions, as highlighted by her resistance to DNA testing in cases that could have exonerated prisoners. Now, there's at least one case like that, but there may have been others. As California Attorney General from 2011 to 2017, Harris earned a reputation as a, quote, tough on crime prosecutor, end quote. Despite public criticism, she defended the state's use of solitary confinement, She declined to support marijuana legalization until it was politically expedient and refused to prosecute corrupt police officers. So she was not exactly as progressive as some would try to portray her later on. Her office also fought to keep nonviolent offenders incarcerated, arguing in court that releasing them would deplete California's prison labor force, a stance that drew severe condemnation from criminal justice reform advocates. So, yeah, that's not too great from a progressive perspective. In 2015, prosecutor Robert Murray allegedly falsified a confession transcript. State Attorney General Kamala Harris appealed the indictment. Miscellany News notes it was the third time she appealed a prosecutorial misconduct dismissal in less than 3 months. So think about that. You know, there's long been a call for uh, having more of these corrupt uh, prosecutors facing scrutiny and possible firings. But people like Kamala Harris made it harder for that to happen. And that's why she lost some credibility, especially among progressives. But even if people don't consider themselves all that progressive, they might still be concerned about that sort of thing. So, what about her political ascent and Senate years? In 2016, Harris won a seat in the U.S. Senate, becoming only the second black woman and first South Asian American senator. During her tenure from 2017 to 2021, she gained national prominence for her pointed questioning of Trump administration officials, including Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. So that's fine. While Harris advocated for progressive policies such as the DREAM Act, federal cannabis legalization, and healthcare reform, critics argue that her actions in the Senate were often symbolic rather than transformational, failing to challenge the fundamental structures of power. Now, you can say a number of things about that, but I'm just trying to objectively state what some critics were saying, from the left. And of course, you had critics from the right as well. The 2020 presidential bid and Biden partnership was also, at times, scandalous. Harris launched her bid for the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination, but dropped out before the primaries due to a lack of support. And that, in some ways, makes her near success in 2024 more impressive because she overcame a previous loss and she had less time to do so. That was a little bit significant. Despite her weak campaign back then, Joe Biden selected her as his running mate, likely to appeal to a diverse voter base. Their ticket defeated incumbent Donald Trump and, well, whoever his I guess it was Mike Pence who was his vice presidential choice, but he of course fell out of disfavor with Trump later on. But as vice president, Harris's most notable role was presiding over a split Senate, where she cast 33 tie-breaking votes, more than any other vice president. However, the legislative victories she helped secure, including the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act, were limited in their scope, and uh, I would say they failed to address systemic inequalities in a way that better secured victory in 2024. There's a whole story there. You had people like Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin throwing monkey wrenches into that uh, proposed legislation. And then when it was finally passed, it was significantly watered down. So What about the 2024 presidential run uh, and the symbolic politics there? Harris became the Democratic nominee for president in 2024, as I'm sure you all know. She followed Biden's decision, or this was following Biden's decision not to seek reelection. So he waited a little bit long to withdraw his own candidacy. And in some ways, that kind of sabotaged Kamala, yet she still had a largely successful campaign. It just was not successful enough. She did not overwin, which is why the other person won. So while her campaign emphasized diversity and inclusion, she didn't make that the centerpiece of her campaign. She did largely ignore identity politics and really ran more on economic issues and things like that. It did fail to confront the entrenched systems of capitalism, imperialism, and police violence that continue to oppress people, of course. So, from a progressive perspective, she didn't do enough, and she didn't distance herself from Joe Biden as far as the genocide in Gaza goes. Like, she didn't really win over progressive voters in that way. And that definitely could have cost her millions of votes, as I've noted before in the past. So if she had just distanced herself from Joe Biden and pledged a different policy, it could have mattered. It could have actually won her some votes, at least some lesser of two evils sort of votes. But instead, I'm pretty sure that at least, let's say at least 1.5 million people likely decided to sit out the election because, well, it would have been hard to vote for somebody who was, supportive of that. Like if you're a Palestinian, I mean, you can even put aside the idea of if you're a progressive, if you're a Palestinian, why on earth would you vote for, Biden or Kamala or Trump? If you're voting for them, you're kind of voting for these candidates who are killing your relatives. So critics from the left argue that Harris's record demonstrates an unwavering loyalty to neoliberal policies that perpetuate inequality under the guise of progressive reform. And it's not like I'm saying that she wasn't the lesser of two evils or something like that. You can definitely make that argument. It is a pretty solid case given how unhinged the Trump administration has been. But nevertheless, you have to earn people's votes. I keep on trying to emphasize this to people. You're not just you're not just going to have guaranteed voter turnout just because you're a little bit better or maybe even a lot better than the other candidate. You have to you have to make it seem like a slam dunk decision for the voters to show up and vote for you. If you're not doing that, if you're not solid on some key issues, you're gonna lose some voters. That's just how it goes. So there is a bit of a legacy of symbolism over substance. There were a few good bills that were passed under Joe Biden. The CHIPS Act, from what I understand, was bringing like computer chip manufacturing back to the United States, which was good. But it's not the sort of policy that people would immediately feel, and it wasn't as wide ranging as something like, oh, I created and implemented universal health care or something like that, universal daycare and whatnot. So Kamala Harris's career is marked by historic firsts, but her legacy remains mired in some controversy. Her policies as a prosecutor and her cautious approach to systemic reform demonstrate a reluctance to challenge the institutions that, at least in some cases, perpetuate injustice. and actually undermine her ability to win elections. While her tenure as vice president shattered glass ceilings, it also reinforced a political system that prioritizes representation over genuine structural change. So, like the election wins, the horse race aspect of the election was sort of taking priority over actual policy priorities that would attain more solid footing among the general voting public. If you improve people's lives in ways that they can genuinely notice, then you're going to better secure their votes in our system as it still stands now. I know that in the future, the the ability to vote is going to be a, a, a lot more restricted if some of these GOP activists, you could call them, have their way. These fascistic pieces of shit. Um, but anyway, the main point is, if you have the population on your side, there's a much bigger chance that you'll enjoy a victory. So, from her early days as a prosecutor to her time as vice president, Harris's career illustrates the limitations of relying on representation within a system that continues to oppress the very communities she claims to champion. For those seeking true liberation, her record serves as a reminder that real change requires dismantling oppressive policies, not just diversifying their leadership. It might be fine to have somebody who looks like you at the top, but if they're still, engaging in some oppressive policies, it doesn't matter as much. All right, so I've been yapping about her long enough. So let's see, the fetid fever dream flashback of the week. That's Joe Biden. So this is a rather uh, Biden-esque episode. Joe Biden's political career is marked by numerous controversies, but assessing them from a deeper perspective focuses on exposing state violence, the illusion of democracy, and the protection of power structures. The same themes I was talking about with Harris and with Trump. There are some key scandals involving Biden, so let's view things through that lens and see why he might have not won in or why he had to drop out, I should say, in 2024. So number one of the things that I think was a pretty significant factor was the complicity in the Gaza genocide, which basically started before 2023 but is still ongoing. Biden's unconditional support for Israel's military campaign in Gaza, despite mounting evidence of war crimes, has drawn international condemnation. He approved billions in military aid and blocked ceasefire resolutions at the United Nations, enabling Israel's bombing campaign and deliberate starvation of Palestinians. Reports show that Netanyahu's government weaponized food by restricting humanitarian aid, creating mass starvation. And that's a very deliberate policy. You can find officials admitting that. I mean, they're very candid about it. So even though they will claim that they're falsely being accused of engaging in genocidal policies, the mass starvation campaign is something that they openly and plainly admit. So, yeah, the Biden administration publicly expressed concern, but they took no meaningful actions to stop the slaughter, effectively endorsing Israel's genocidal campaign, which again includes deliberate starvation, but you also have the bombing of hospitals, schools, churches and mosques, basically everything. I don't think there's even a single university that has been left standing. So this exposes the U.S. state's role as a global enforcer of imperialism. Biden's actions show that far too often electoral politics only serve the interests of capital and empire, regardless of who occupies the White House. I mean, that's the harsh reality here. Sure, you could say that Trump is going to make it worse, but look who got the ball rolling, unfortunately. So this is why so many people, had a hard time uh, showing up to vote. Even though more people may have voted than in previous elections, that was more due to desperation. It wasn't just because people saw that, oh, the candidates are better this time. No, and in a way, they showed up more because the candidates are worse, and they had to make that agonizing lesser of two evils choice. So Biden's complicity in genocide reflects the bipartisan commitment to maintaining U.S. hegemony, where Palestinian lives are expendable in service of geopolitical control. His support for genocide reveals the inherent violence of the state, which thus far has not been reformed through voting or diplomacy in a truly successful manner. Humanitarian rhetoric masks the state's real function, which is maintaining systems of violent oppression. So then there's the second part of my analysis here, which is the crime bill and mass incarceration, which was something that happened in 1994, or that was really kicked off significantly in 1994. As a senator, Biden was a key architect of the 1994 crime bill, which fueled mass incarceration, disproportionately targeting black and brown communities, and it also expanded mandatory minimum sentencing, increased funding for prisons, including private prisons. At least I'm pretty sure that's, private prisons were a part of this, and militarized police forces across the U.S. Biden bragged about writing legislation that would, quote, do everything but hang people for jaywalking, end quote. And if you don't believe he said that, you can actually watch the clip of him saying that on the C-SPAN archives. This was back when Biden was less afraid to admit he's a bald person, because you can actually you can actually see his bald spot much more prominently. But yeah, he said that the legislation would do everything but hang people for jaywalking. Quite a thing to brag about. So the prison industrial complex is a cornerstone of increasingly oligarchic state control. It's part of, the growth of what we're seeing now. He laid much of the groundwork for it. And Biden's role in expanding the system demonstrates how the state weaponizes criminal law to control marginalized populations. The crime bill perpetuated cycles of poverty, criminalization, and surveillance, reinforcing racial hierarchy. So, from that standpoint, the bill underscores how law and order are often tools of oppression, designed to protect property and capital while punishing dissent and poverty. So, well, there's an interesting one now, and one that's actually not talked about enough. So, my third part of the deeper analysis here is the student debt crisis and corporate ties. So, sort of an underexamined scandal is that Biden was a key supporter of the 2005 Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act, which made it nearly impossible to discharge student debt through bankruptcy. The legislation benefited big banks and financial institutions while locking millions of Americans into lifelong debt. So Debt is a tool of control, ensuring that people remain bound to the capitalist system. Biden's allegiance to financial institutions highlights the state's role in protecting the interests of capital at the expense of working people. The student debt crisis keeps individuals tethered to jobs and prevents meaningful resistance or autonomy to the debt cycle, which is similar to, it's so common that a lot of people consider it, just a part of a person's life process, their life cycle. You accumulate debt. It shows that you're a regular American citizen or whatever. But it makes it easier for the financial system to operate as a form of wage slavery, and Biden's support of corporate interests perpetuates such exploitation. And it's frankly a bit of legislation that never needed to exist, but it was again something that the system wanted in place to make it easier for financial institutions to exploit vulnerable people who are artificially made to depend on these student loans and whatever, and debt making institutions in general. That's one of the ironies of capitalism. You're told your entire life that it's a free market system, it's people freely making decisions, but really what's happening is that uh, the rich and powerful are dominating resources and choking off alternative options, and they do it through the force of law, on a global basis. So what are you going to do? You have to live your lives by attaching yourself to these institutions because you have a lot of options that are simply choked off. You know, that's sort of the intention of the design. So, okay, the fourth point of analysis, the Afghanistan withdrawal and continuing imperialism. Biden's chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan ended a 20-year U.S. occupation, but left behind a humanitarian catastrophe. So, a lot of people understandably think it's good that we withdrew from Afghanistan, but nevertheless, his administration's hasty retreat abandoned Afghan civilians to Taliban rule while freezing billions in Afghan assets, worsening an economic crisis. So that's something people don't talk about as much as they should. A lot of people focus on the resurgence of the Taliban, but they don't look at the greater point that the war did not mark an end to imperialist intervention. It was a tactical retreat. By seizing Afghan funds and maintaining sanctions, Biden ensured continued economic strangulation of Afghanistan, proving that empire's grip doesn't loosen even after military withdrawal. There's further evidence here that the state operates through violence and economic coercion, leaving devastation in its wake. So, what exactly am I talking about here? Well, Ryan Cooper of the American Prospect wrote a piece called Joe Biden's Senseless Economic Strangulation of Afghanistan. And again, look this article up if you want to read it in more detail. But I'm going to go into some paragraphs here. Cooper notes that I'm quoting him now, the Biden administration announced that it would not release any of the $7 billion in Afghanistan central bank reserves that are currently in U.S. possession and pulled out of talks with the Taliban. The reported reason was that the recent assassination of Al Qaeda leader Ayman al Zawahiri in Kabul revealed that he was living near a house owned by a Taliban Interior Minister Sirajuddin Haqqani. It seems the administration's intention is to inflict collective economic punishment for at least some Taliban leaders having allowed al-Zawahiri to live in Kabul. Previously, the administration had suggested that half of the money could be used to stabilize the country's collapsed economy. Yesterday's announcement was therefore disastrous news for ordinary Afghans who are facing mass unemployment, drought, high inflation, and food shortages, if not outright starvation by the millions. According to a recent report, fully 97% of the country's population is now in poverty.